The sun was a hammer, and the land was its anvil. For months, it had beaten down on Eli McGraw's world, cracking the earth into a mosaic of thirst and baking the clay of the creek bed into a pale, bony white. The grass had long since surrendered, bleached to the color of straw and brittle as old paper. Dust was the only crop this land grew now, a fine red powder that rose with every gust of wind, coating everything: the weathered gray wood of the ranch house, the thirsty leaves of the lone cottonwood, and the lines etched deep around Eli's own eyes. His ranch was an island in a sea of parched prairie, a place defined more by what was absent than by what was there. There was an absence of rain, an absence of neighbors, and, for a long time, an absence of any sound but the ceaseless wind. Eli swung a worn leather saddle over the back of his horse, a stoic buckskin named Cinder. The animal barely flickered an ear. Long accustomed to the routine, every movement Eli made was deliberate, efficient, honed by years of solitude. There was no wasted motion in the way he cinched the saddle, checked the straps, and tied his empty supply sacks behind the cantle. He was a man carved from the same hard landscape he inhabited, tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by labor and hands calloused into tools. His face was a map of his life, weathered by sun and wind, his silence a comfortable habit rather than a mark of anger. He looked out over his domain, a stretch of parched acreage that would have broken a lesser man, and felt not despair, but a stubborn, weary resilience. This land was his, and he was its. The ride to the settlement of Redemption was a long, hot affair. The town was little more than a handful of buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office with a small jail attached. That was the sum of it. Usually, the town had a sleepy, predictable rhythm. But today, the air was different. It was tight, strung like a wire. Men stood in tight knots outside the saloon and the store, their voices low, their glances sharp and suspicious. They looked toward the southern horizon, toward the borderlands, as if expecting trouble to ride in on the next heat shimmer. Eli tied Cinder to the hitching post outside Miller's general store, the wood smooth and polished by 100 other reins. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a tinny jangle. Silas Miller, a man whose frame was as narrow as his world view, looked up from behind the counter. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Eli," he said, his voice a half-whisper. "Heard the news." Eli moved toward the barrels of flour and beans, his gaze methodical. "Heard talk?" "More than talk," Silas insisted, leaning over the counter. He wiped his sweaty palms on his apron. "It was the Henderson party. Wagon train, coming up from the south. Ambushed yesterday evening, not 20 miles from here. All of them. Burned the wagons to the axles." Eli paused, his hand hovering over a sack of coffee beans. He had known the Hendersons, a family with 3 small children and a dream of starting a farm in the north. He pictured their faces, earnest and full of hope. "Who did it?" Silas's eyes darted toward the door, as if the culprits might be listening. "No one knows for sure. Jebediah Smith was out hunting and found the wreckage this morning. He said it was a massacre. Talk in the saloon is it was Blackwood's gang. They've been hitting trade routes hard this season. But others—" He lowered his voice even further. "Others are saying it was Indians. A war party. They claim—" Jebediah said the tracks were all mixed up. Eli said nothing. He knew how fear worked in a town like Redemption. It found the easiest target, the oldest prejudice, and clung to it. Blaming Blackwood was practical. Blaming unseen natives was a deeper, more primal terror. He gathered his supplies: flour, coffee, salt, a box of cartridges, his movements slow and steady, a stark contrast to the frantic energy buzzing through the store. He paid Silas, the clink of coins on the wooden counter unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. He decided to stop at the dusty Spur Saloon for a bottle of whiskey, more for medicinal purposes than for drinking. The moment he pushed through the swinging doors, the low murmur of conversation died. Every eye turned to him. Eli was a man who kept to himself, and his presence in the saloon was rare enough to be an event. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. A group of men at a corner table fell silent, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. McGraw. Sheriff Cobb grunted from his perch at the bar. He was a heavy man, his face perpetually flushed, his badge a dull star on his stained vest. "You hear about the Henderson wagon?" "I heard," Eli said, his voice level. He walked to the bar, keeping his back to the wall. "Ugly business," the sheriff said, shaking his head. He took a long drink of beer. "Found arrows at the scene," Jebediah said, "but the killings, they were done with guns. Does not make a lick of sense. Could be Blackwood's boys trying to throw us off the scent." "Could be," Eli agreed, though he offered no opinion of his own. He bought his bottle, nodded once to the sheriff, and walked out, feeling the weight of their stares on his back. The town felt sick with suspicion, a fever that could break in any direction, and Eli wanted no part of it. He wanted the silence of his ranch, the predictable hardship he understood. The journey home was quieter, the sun beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The heat finally began to break, but the tension from the town lingered in Eli's mind. He thought of the Henderson family, of their laughter, now silenced forever. It was the way of this land. It gave and it took, and it did both with a brutal, silent finality. He was about 10 miles from his homestead when he saw it, a thin, dark finger of smoke, stark against the fading light, rising from a shallow ravine just off the main trail. It was too small for a campfire, too persistent for a brush fire. It was wrong. Eli pulled Cinder to a halt, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in its saddle scabbard. He listened. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. He nudged the horse off the trail, moving cautiously toward the smoke. As he crested a small rise, the scene came into view, and his gut tightened. It was the skeleton of a single wagon, its canvas cover gone, its wooden frame charred and blackened. The contents were spilled and burned, a ruin of personal belongings now reduced to ash and twisted metal. 2 bodies lay nearby, unnaturally still, covered by a rough blanket someone, Jebediah probably, had thrown over them. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of burnt wood, scorched earth, and death. It was a scene of utter devastation, a final, violent stop on a journey to a new life. Eli dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. He scanned the area, his eyes missing nothing. The tracks were a mess, just as the sheriff had said. Hoof prints from a dozen horses, booted footprints, all churned together in the dust. He felt a profound sadness, a weary anger at the cruelty of it all. He was about to turn away, to ride on and leave the dead to their peace, when he heard it. A sound so faint he thought it was the wind, a soft, choked whimper, like a wounded animal. He froze, straining to hear it again. It came from behind the burned-out husk of the wagon. Eli drew his pistol, its familiar weight a cold comfort in his hand, and moved forward, his steps silent. He circled the wreckage, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. There, huddled in the dirt, was a woman. She was half hidden in the long shadows, her body curled into a tight ball. Her dress, once perhaps a simple calico, was torn and blackened with soot, clinging to her small frame. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, matted with dust and something that looked like dried blood. One side of her face was bruised, her skin scraped raw. She was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shiver that seemed to shake her to her very soul. Her arms were wrapped around herself, clutching the tattered fabric of her dress as if it were the only thing holding her together. Eli lowered his pistol, the sight of her chasing the tension from his shoulders, replaced by a deep, aching pity. He took a slow step forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal all the color from them, leaving them dark, bottomless pools of fear. She scrambled backward, pushing herself away from him with her hands and feet, a raw, guttural sound of panic catching in her throat. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. He held his empty hands out, palms forward, showing he meant no harm. "I saw the smoke." She stared at him, her chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. She did not seem to understand his words, only the threat of his presence. He saw a burn on her arm, an angry red mark blistering the skin. He saw the grime and the soot and the blood, and beneath it all, he saw a young woman who had been dragged through hell and left on the other side. He took another careful step. "What is your name?" She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. Her lips parted, but only a dry whisper came out. She swallowed hard, trying again. "Ma-ra." The name was a fragment, broken and foreign on her tongue. Her accent was thick, one he could not place, layered with the hoarse texture of smoke and screaming. "Mara," he repeated softly. It was all she could give him. It would have to be enough. The sun had now touched the horizon, and the air was growing cold. She could not stay here. Eli moved without another word. He unstrapped his heavy duster from the back of his saddle and walked back to her. She flinched as he approached, her eyes tracking his every move, but she was too weak, too broken to flee. He knelt before her and gently, carefully, draped the coat over her shaking shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, the worn wool a shield against the coming night. "We need to go," he said simply. He straightened up and offered her a hand. She stared at it as if it were a snake, then looked back at his face. He kept his expression neutral, patient, after a long moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. She slowly, hesitantly, placed her trembling hand in his. Her skin was cold. He helped her to her feet. She swayed, her legs unsteady, and leaned heavily against him. He could feel the tremors that racked her body. With no more words, he scooped her up into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of rags and bones and fear. She made a small sound of protest, a muffled cry, and her entire body went rigid. "It is all right," he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. "I'm just getting you on the horse." He lifted her into his saddle, then mounted behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. She sat stiff as a board against his chest, her head bowed. The journey back to his ranch was wordless, the only sounds the steady plod of Cinder's hooves on the dusty trail and the ragged whisper of Mara's breathing. The sky bled from purple to a deep, star-littered black. The vast emptiness of the prairie pressed in on them, a silence that was both peaceful and menacing. Eli could feel the terror rolling off her in waves. It was a living thing, palpable in the darkness. Her hands were clenched in the horse's mane, her knuckles white. Then, one hand slowly, deliberately, moved to her own throat. Her fingers closed around a heavy silver necklace that lay against her collarbone, half hidden by the collar of his coat. It was an ornate piece, intricately carved, out of place with her simple, torn dress. Her voice, when she spoke, was so quiet he almost did not hear it over the wind. It was a plea, a prayer, a desperate command. "Please," she whispered, her breath hitching in a sob. "Please, do not take it off." Eli looked down at the top of her head, at the hand clutching the silver chain as if it were her last anchor in a storm-tossed sea. He did not understand, but he recognized the sheer desperation in her tone. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, even though she could not see it. "I will not," he promised into the darkness. His ranch house was a small silhouette against the starry sky when they finally arrived. He dismounted and gently lifted her down, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground before he was guiding her toward the door. Inside, he lit a lantern, and the small, simple room was filled with a warm, golden light. It was a single room, clean and Spartan. A stone hearth, a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and shelves lined with a few books and provisions. He sat her down in a chair by the cold fireplace and went to work. He stoked the embers from the morning, adding wood until a small fire crackled to life, chasing away the chill. He filled a basin with water from the barrel inside the door and heated it over the flames. He found a clean cloth and a small tin of salve. When he turned back to her, she was exactly as he had left her, huddled in his coat, watching him with those same haunted eyes. "I need to clean your wounds," he said, his voice gentle. She flinched when he knelt in front of her, but she did not pull away. He started with her face, dabbing at the scrapes with the warm, wet cloth. He worked with a slow, careful patience, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the cut on her forehead, the raw scrape along her jaw. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a clean path through the soot on her cheek. He moved to the burn on her arm, his touch feather-light as he cleaned the edges and applied a thin layer of soothing salve. She hissed in pain but did not move. Throughout it all, she did not speak. Her silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. He could feel her watching him, studying him, trying to decide if he was a savior or just another monster in a world that was apparently full of them. He knew she must be hungry, but he suspected she would not be able to stomach much. He prepared a simple broth, letting it simmer over the fire until it was warm. He held the bowl out to her. She took it with shaking hands, spilling some of the liquid onto the floor. She drank it slowly, mechanically, her gaze never leaving his face. When she was done, he took the empty bowl and gestured toward the bed in the corner. "You can rest there." She looked from him to the bed and back again, her expression filled with a deep, animal wariness. She expected a trick. She expected a price. In her world, he realized, kindness was probably just a prelude to cruelty. "I will sleep in the chair," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He banked the fire, leaving just enough embers to keep the room from growing cold. She stood, still wrapped in his enormous coat, and shuffled to the bed. She did not take the coat off, but simply climbed under the single quilt, pulling it up to her chin. Within moments, she was asleep. But it was not a peaceful slumber. It was the sleep of the exhausted, the traumatized, an escape into a darkness that was no less frightening than the one she had just endured. Eli sat in the wooden chair by the hearth, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He did not sleep. He watched, and he listened to the silence of his home, now filled with the troubled breathing of a stranger. Hours passed. The moon climbed high in the sky, its pale light slanting through the single window. Then she began to whimper. It started as a low moan, a sound of pure anguish. Her body thrashed beneath the quilt, her hands clenching and unclenching. She was trapped in a nightmare, reliving the horror he had pulled her from. Muffled words, in a language he did not recognize, tumbled from her lips, frantic and pleading. Eli rose from his chair and walked quietly to the doorway of his own bed. He stood there in the shadows, watching her. The moonlight fell across her face, illuminating the tracks of fresh tears. She looked so young, so terribly vulnerable. The town might call her a fugitive, a survivor of an outlaw gang. Or worse, they would see suspicion and danger. But all Eli saw was a girl who had lost everything, a soul scorched by a fire far hotter than the one that had consumed her wagon. He felt a powerful, unfamiliar surge in his chest. It was more than pity. It was a fierce, primal instinct to protect, to stand between her and the world that had tried to destroy her. It was something deeper, a stirring in the lonely, quiet corners of his heart that he had thought were long since sealed off. He was torn between the urge to wake her from her terror and the knowledge that waking would bring her no peace. He stayed there until her frantic movements subsided, until her breathing evened out into a fragile, temporary calm. Then he stepped back outside onto the porch, needing the cold night air to clear his head. He looked out across the vast, dark prairie, a landscape that had always mirrored his own solitude. From far off in the darkness, a coyote let out a long, mournful cry. Another answered from a distant hill, their voices weaving together a song of loneliness that drifted across the plains. The sound no longer felt like his alone. Tonight, it was a duet. It echoed the silent, sleeping grief of the woman in his house, and the profound, aching loneliness that he now realized neither of them could escape. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Time on Eli's ranch was not measured by the clock in town, but by the sun's long journey across the sky, by the needs of the animals, and now, by the slow, fragile healing of the woman he had brought back from the ashes. Mara remained a creature of silence, but her fear began to recede like a slow tide, leaving behind a shore of profound sorrow. She started to move about the small house, at first with the hesitant, wary steps of a ghost, then with a growing sense of purpose. She began to help. It started with small things. One morning, Eli came in from the barn to find the wooden floor, which he swept out once a week at best, had been swept clean. The single rug shaken free of dust. Another day. He found one of his work shirts, torn at the elbow, laid out on his bed with the hole stitched closed. The stitches were small and neat, a line of delicate work that seemed entirely out of place in his rough-hewn world. She would rise with him at dawn, her movements as quiet as a shadow, and help feed the few chickens he kept, scattering the grain with a grace that felt foreign and ancient. He watched her, often when he thought she was not aware of his gaze. He learned the landscape of her caution. A pan dropped on the stone hearth would make her jump, her whole body flinching as if she had been struck, her eyes darting toward the door, wide with a hunted look. If he moved too quickly past her in the narrow space of the cabin, or if their hands brushed as he passed her a cup of water, she would recoil, a swift, instinctive pulling away that spoke of a deep-seated terror of human touch. Yet, there were other moments. Sometimes, while he was mending a harness on the porch, he would feel her eyes on him. When he looked up, she would not look away immediately. Her gaze would hold his for a long second, and in the dark depths of her eyes, he would see something other than fear. It was a profound, unspoken gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the sanctuary he had given her. In those moments, the gulf of silence between them did not feel empty, but charged with a fragile, growing connection. Her devotion to the silver necklace was absolute. He saw her once at the water basin outside, washing the dust of the day from her face and arms. She worked the wet cloth with meticulous care around the heavy chain, tilting her head to wash the skin of her neck, but never, not for an instant, attempting to remove it. It was as much a part of her as her own skin, a silver root that bound her to a past she could not speak of. He wondered what it represented, what secrets were held in the weight of it. But he knew better than to ask. Her story would unspool in its own time, or not at all. About 2 weeks after her arrival, 2 of his seasonal ranch hands, Caleb and Jedediah, rode in from the north pasture. They were young, hardened by the work, but not yet by life, their faces still open and artless. They were there to report on the state of a small herd of cattle Eli kept grazing miles away. As they dismounted, their easy banter died on their lips. They saw Mara, who was hanging a washed cloth to dry on the line. She froze at the sight of them, her back going rigid, and she quickly retreated into the house. Caleb, the quieter of the two, had the decency to look down at his boots, but Jedediah, bolder and less thoughtful, stared at the cabin door and then turned to Eli with a knowing smirk. "Well now, Eli," Jedediah said, his voice loud in the quiet yard, Did not figure you for the type to take in strays. Who's the burned girl?" Eli's face, already stern, hardened into granite. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He took a slow step toward the young man, and the air around him grew cold. "Her name is Mara," he said, his voice low and flat, each word a carefully placed stone. "She is a guest in my home. You will show her your respect, or you will find another place to draw your pay." Jedediah's smirk vanished, replaced by a flush of embarrassment. "No offense meant, Eli, just—" "Give me your report on the herd." Eli cut him off, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. The two hands gave their accounting quickly, their eyes nervously avoiding the cabin. When they finished, Eli dismissed them with a curt nod. "Check the fence line by the east ridge on your way back. Be on your way." He watched them mount their horses and ride off, the dust rising behind them. He had drawn a line, not just for them, but for the entire world. Inside this fence, on this small patch of land, she was not the burned girl or a stray. She was Mara, and she was under his protection. The incident forced a realization upon him. He could not keep the world at bay forever. He was running low on coffee and flour, and the wound on Mara's arm, while healing, needed a fresh supply of salve. He would have to go to town. The thought of leaving her alone, even for a day, settled like a stone in his gut. The morning he left, he stood by the door, his hat in his hands. "I am riding to Redemption," he told her. "I will be back before sundown." He pointed to the rifle resting on its pegs above the hearth. "You know how to use one of these?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the weapon. "Bolt the door behind me," he said. "Do not open it for anyone." Another nod. He wanted to say more, to offer some word of comfort, but the words would not come. He simply put on his hat and left, the sound of the heavy wooden bolt sliding into place behind him echoing in the quiet morning. The town of Redemption felt even more on edge than before. The Henderson massacre was still the only topic of conversation, the story growing more gruesome and speculative with each telling. Eli ignored the whispers and the stares, his face an impassive mask as he gathered his supplies at Miller's store. He was about to leave when Sheriff Cobb stepped out of his office and blocked his path. "McGraw." "A word," the sheriff said, his expression grim. He led Eli away from the main thoroughfare, into the narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith shop. The clang of the smith's hammer punctuated the sheriff's low words. "Got a circular in on the stage yesterday," Cobb began, pulling a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. "From the federal marshal down south. It is about that Blackwood gang business." He unfolded the paper. It was a wanted poster, the ink stark against the cheap paper. There was a crude sketch of a woman's face, generic enough that it could have been anyone. "Says here there was a lone survivor of the gang after the shootout with the lawmen," the sheriff continued, reading from the poster. "A woman. Goes by the name Maribel Cortez. Accused of taking part in a half-dozen robberies. And murder. Says she is armed and dangerous." He looked up from the paper, his gaze sharp and direct. "The description says she is young, dark-haired, and speaks with a foreign accent." Eli's blood ran cold, but his expression did not change. "That is a description that could fit 1,000 women." "Maybe so," Cobb conceded, his eyes not leaving Eli's. "But there are not 1,000 women who've turned up half dead in the middle of a massacre site. I heard you took someone in, Eli, someone you found out at the Henderson wreckage." The town's gossip had done its work. "I found a victim. Sheriff," Eli said, his voice hard. "A girl who was burned and terrified, not a killer." "Victims can be killers, too," Cobb countered, though his voice lacked real conviction. He was a man doing a job, following a thread. "This poster offers a $500 reward. That is enough to make folks mighty curious. Men will be looking for her. I am telling you this as a courtesy. Eli, if you are harboring a fugitive, it will end badly. For her And for you. I am sheltering a survivor, Eli said, his jaw tight. He met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. And I do not take kindly to men getting mighty curious on my land. Sheriff Cobb sighed, folding the poster and tucking it back into his vest. He looked tired, older than his years. Just be careful, Eli. Trouble has a way of finding folks out on their own, and it sounds like you are not on your own anymore. The long ride home was a torment. The sheriff's words echoed with the rhythm of Cinder's hooves. Maribel Cortez, accused of murder, a foreign accent. The pieces fit, if you wanted them to. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to probe the edges of his conviction. He thought of her silence. Was it born of trauma or of guilt? He thought of her fear. Was it the fear of a victim or of a fugitive? He had built his life on what he could see and touch, on the solid certainties of the land, but Mara was a mystery, a puzzle of which he had only a few scattered pieces. For the first time, he considered the possibility that his instincts had failed him, that the pity he felt had blinded him to a darker truth. He hated the feeling. It was a poison, fouling the clean certainty he had felt in his gut. He spurred Cinder onward, his heart a battleground between the sheriff's warning and the memory of Mara's haunted eyes. As his ranch came into view, nestled in the vast expanse of the prairie, his pace slowed. He saw a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the deepening blue of the sky. And then he saw her. She was sitting in a chair by the single window, his mending basket in her lap. The last rays of the evening sun streamed through the glass, enveloping her in a soft, golden light. Her head was bent over her work, her expression one of quiet concentration. A small, almost inaudible humming sound drifted from the house, a simple, sad melody he had never heard before. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow. The woman in that window, bathed in the gentle light of dusk, her hands busy with a simple, peaceful task. She could not be the hardened killer on the sheriff's poster. It was impossible. The image was so profoundly at odds with the suggestion of violence and deceit that it shattered his doubt into 1,000 pieces. In that moment, his heart won its war with his head. He did not know her story. He did not know her secrets, but he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that this woman was no murderer. That night, the sky broke. The change came on swiftly, the air growing heavy and electric. Dark, bruised-looking clouds rolled in from the west, swallowing the stars. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that rattled the wooden frame of the small house. Then the rain came, first as gentle taps against the roof, then as a driving, relentless torrent. Eli and Mara sat in the tense silence of the cabin, the only light coming from the flickering fire in the hearth. The storm was a wild thing, a fury of nature unleashed upon the plains. Rain lashed against the window pane like handfuls of thrown gravel. The wind howled around the corners of the house, seeking entry. And then the thunder began, a low, distant rumble that grew steadily into deafening cracks of sound that shook the very foundations of the earth. With each clap of thunder, Eli saw Mara flinch. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. She stared into the fire, but he knew she was not seeing the flames. She was somewhere else, trapped in a memory. A bolt of lightning struck nearby, a brilliant, blinding flash that illuminated the room in a stark, white glare. It was followed instantaneously by a crack of thunder so loud, so violent, it sounded as if the sky itself had been torn in two. That was the sound that broke her. Mara cried out, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. She scrambled back from her chair, falling to the floor and curling into a ball, her hands covering her head. Sobs racked her body, deep, tearing sounds of a grief and fear so immense it could no longer be contained. Eli was at her side in an instant, kneeling on the floor beside her. "Mara," he said, his voice a low anchor in the storm of her weeping. Her story came out then, not as a narrative, but as fragments of agony, broken pieces of a shattered life forced from her lips between sobs. Her English was fractured, tangled with a language he did not know, but her meaning was terrifyingly clear. "The fire, so much fire," she gasped, her body trembling. "They came, los hombres malos. They took everything." She spoke of a family, a father, a mother, a brother, and of a home that was no more. She described being taken captive, forced to ride with the outlaws for days, a prisoner and a witness to their cruelty. Then came the final nightmare. Gunfire, everywhere. The lawmen. They came, shooting. She had been caught in the crossfire, a battle between two forces that saw her as nothing and had been left for dead among the bodies of her captors and her family alike. Eli listened in absolute silence, the storm outside a pale imitation of the tempest raging inside him. He felt a cold, murderous rage build in his chest, a hatred for the faceless men, the outlaws, the lawmen. It did not matter. Who had put this look in her eyes? Who had filled her world with so much fire and death? He wanted to promise her vengeance, to hunt them down, but he knew they were ghosts, long scattered to the winds. All he could offer was his presence, a steady rock in the flood of her pain. As her weeping began to subside into shuddering breaths, he reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray, tear-soaked strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was clumsy, his calloused fingers unaccustomed to such tenderness. But she did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, a silent plea for comfort. He gently wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb, his own hand trembling slightly. In the soft firelight, he saw it. The heavy silver chain of her necklace had rubbed against a small, half-healed wound on her neck, irritating the skin and making it red and angry. His instinct was simple, practical. He needed to clean it. "Let me look at that," he murmured, his voice thick. He reached forward with his other hand, his fingers aiming for the clasp of the necklace, intending only to move it aside. Her reaction was instantaneous and violent. She grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Her eyes, still swimming with tears, were now wide with a new, sharper terror, a panic that eclipsed all her grief. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, do not take it off." He froze, his fingers hovering inches from the silver chain. It was the same plea she had made on that first night, but now, in the intimacy of her breakdown, it carried 1,000 times more weight. He looked from the necklace to her terrified eyes, and he finally understood. This was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a relic. It was her armor. It was the last solid thing in a world that had been turned to smoke and ash. Taking it from her would be like tearing away her skin, leaving her soul utterly exposed. He slowly pulled his hand back, and with it, he let go of any lingering shadow of the sheriff's doubt. He covered her hand, still clutching his wrist, with his own. He held her gaze, wanting her to see the truth in his eyes. "I will not," he promised, his voice soft but firm, a solemn vow made in the heart of the storm. "Not until you say I can." The promise hung in the air between them, more solid than the cabin walls, more real than the thunder that still grumbled in the distance. It was a pact of trust, an oath of protection freely given and desperately received. In that moment, something shifted. A bond that had been forming in silence and shared solitude was now forged in the fire of her pain and sealed with his word. They were no longer just a man and a survivor. They were two souls bound together, and neither of them yet knew how deeply that promise would truly tie them. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and quiet in its wake. It was as if the violent confession of the heavens had licensed a subtle change in the small cabin, clearing the air of some of its unspoken tension. The promise Eli had made that night became the bedrock of their new reality, a foundation of trust upon which something fragile and tentative began to grow. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet unfolding. like a desert flower cautiously opening its petals after a rare rain. Mara began to smile. The first time he saw it, it was so brief he almost missed it. She was watching Cinder, his steady buckskin horse, try to nudge a treat from Eli's pocket, his big head bobbing insistently. A small, fleeting curve touched her lips, a glimmer of light in the long twilight of her sadness. Eli felt it in his chest like a physical warmth, a strange and welcome ache. Soon, the smiles came more often. They were shy, hesitant things, but they were real. He saw one when a young foal in the pasture kicked up its heels and raced its own shadow. He saw another when he managed to repair a broken chair that had been a constant source of frustration. Then, one afternoon, he heard her laugh. He was returning from the far pasture, and she was by the corral, watching the horses. A gust of wind had caught the old hat he had given her to wear, sending it tumbling into the enclosure. Two of the younger, more spirited horses shied away from it, then approached it with comical caution, nudging it with their noses and then leaping back as if it were alive. The sound of her laughter, clear and musical, drifted across the yard. It was not a loud sound, but it struck Eli with more force than a clap of thunder. He stopped, hidden by the corner of the barn, and just listened. He watched her shoulders shake with amusement, her face unguarded for a precious moment. A profound sense of peace settled over him. So deep and unfamiliar it was almost painful. It was the feeling of life returning to a place that had long been barren, a feeling he had not realized he had been missing until that very second. He began to teach her the ways of his world, not out of necessity, but from a shared, unspoken desire to fill the long, quiet days. He taught her to ride properly, not as a terrified passenger, but as a confident horsewoman. He put her on his oldest, gentlest mare, and walked alongside her for hours until the rigid fear in her posture softened into a natural grace. Her body, once frail and weakened by trauma, grew stronger. The haunted, starved look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a steady, quiet resolve. He taught her to shoot the rifle. He set up old tins on a fence post and showed her how to hold the heavy weapon, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to breathe, aim, and squeeze the trigger. The first time she fired it, the recoil sent her stumbling backward, and the loud report made her flinch, her eyes wide with the memory of other gunshots. But she did not drop it. She squared her shoulders, reloaded, and tried again. Soon, she was hitting the tins with consistent accuracy, her expression one of fierce, determined concentration. She was not just learning a skill, she was reclaiming a piece of her own power, refusing to be a victim ever again. They worked together, mending fences under the vast, blue sky. They moved in a comfortable silence, their tasks weaving a simple partnership. He would dig the post holes, and she would carry the wires. He would hammer, and she would hold the posts steady. The land no longer felt haunted by his loneliness. It felt shared. Her presence filled the empty spaces he had long grown accustomed to. He found himself talking more, telling her about the land, the seasons, the names of the wildflowers that were beginning to bloom in the wake of the rains. She would listen, her dark eyes attentive, occasionally offering a single, softly spoken word in response. But their fragile peace was an island, and the world beyond it was still full of judgment and suspicion. Their nearest neighbors were the Granthams, a family who ran a small, hardscrabble farm 5 miles to the east. Martha Grantham, a woman whose piety was sharper than a barbed wire fence, rode over one afternoon on the pretext of borrowing a cup of sugar. Her real purpose was clear the moment she laid eyes on Mara. Her gaze raked over Mara from head to toe, a cold, clinical assessment that was more insulting than any slur. "I heard you had taken in company, Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice dripping with sanctimonious disapproval. She did not look at Mara as she spoke, as if the girl were a piece of furniture. "People in town are talking. They say it is not proper. A man like you, living out here alone with—" She paused, searching for the right word. "With a woman of no reputation." Before Eli could answer, Mara quietly excused herself and retreated into the cabin, the door closing softly behind her. Eli turned his full attention to Mrs. Grantham, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "Her name is Mara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she has a better reputation in one of her fingers than you have in your entire gossiping town. If you came for sugar, Martha, take it and go. If you came to cast judgment, you can ride on right now. My home is not your church." The woman flushed, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She stammered a refusal of the sugar and turned her horse around, riding away with her back ramrod straight. Eli watched her go, a cold anger burning in his gut. He knew this was only the beginning. The prejudice of the outside world only served to strengthen the bond within the cabin walls. A quiet romance began to bloom in the spaces between their words, nurtured by small gestures and stolen glances. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh, cool water for her on the porch in the afternoons, knowing the heat tired her. It was in the way she began to leave a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth for him by the door when he went out for his morning chores. It was in the way their eyes would meet across the dinner table, a silent conversation passing between them that neither could have put into words. One evening, he worked late at his workbench in the barn, repairing a broken axle on the small farm wagon. He was tired, his muscles aching, his hands stained with grease. He had lost track of time, lost in the familiar rhythm of his work, until he saw a soft light appear in the barn doorway. It was Mara, holding a lantern high. The golden light framed her, softening the lines of her face and making her dark hair shine like polished mahogany. She had brought a plate of food for him, stew and fresh bread, and a mug of hot coffee. "You did not come for supper," she said softly. It was the first full sentence he had ever heard her initiate. "I lost the time," he replied, his voice rough. He put down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. She set the lantern down on the workbench and held the plate out to him. As he reached for it, his calloused fingers brushed against hers. A jolt, sharp and warm as a lightning strike, passed between them. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it set the air ablaze. They both froze, their hands hovering in the space between them. He could feel the sudden, ragged intake of her breath. He looked from their hands to her face. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted. In that moment, the air in the barn grew thick with everything they had not said, everything they had not done. The desire that had been simmering beneath the surface of their quiet companionship was suddenly, undeniably present, a living thing in the lantern-lit darkness. He wanted to close the distance between them, to touch her face, to erase the lingering shadows of fear from her eyes. But he saw the flicker of apprehension that tempered the surprise in her expression, and he held himself back. The restraint was a physical effort, a tightening in his chest. He took the plate from her, their fingers separating, breaking the spell. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice hoarser than before. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned and walked back to the house, leaving him alone with the lantern, the food, and the powerful, lingering echo of her touch. Beneath this fragile, growing intimacy, however, the outside world was closing in. Eli had to make another trip to Redemption for supplies he could not do without. He left with a sense of deep foreboding, a feeling that had only grown since his last conversation with Sheriff Cobb. His fears were realized the moment he rode into town. Tacked to the wall of the sheriff's office, and to the post outside the saloon, were new posters. The paper was fresh, the ink dark and stark. The sketch of the woman was clearer this time, more detailed. It was still a crude likeness, but there was something in the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, that was unmistakably Mara. The name printed in bold letters was the same, Maribel Cortez, but beneath it, the words were different, harsher. Wanted for murder and robbery, and below that, $500 reward, dead or alive. Eli's blood ran cold. This was not a circular from a distant marshal anymore. This was a bounty. It was an open invitation to every drifter, every gunman, every desperate man within 100 miles to come hunting. He saw two rough-looking men standing by the saloon, studying the poster with greedy eyes. They were strangers, their faces hard, their pistols worn low on their hips. Bounty hunters. They were already here. He felt a surge of cold panic. He bought his supplies with a grim, silent efficiency, his mind racing. He had to get back to the ranch. He had to hide her, to protect her. He tore one of the posters from the saloon post when no one was looking, stuffing it into his saddlebag, the rough paper feeling like a death warrant in his hands. He rode Cinder harder than he ever had before, the urgency a spur in his own side. He felt as though he were in a race against the cold-eyed men he had seen in town, against the greed and violence the poster would surely unleash. When he got back to the ranch, Mara was waiting for him on the porch. She must have seen the urgency in the way he rode, the hard set of his jaw. She knew something was wrong. The fragile peace that had settled between them in recent weeks evaporated, replaced by the old, familiar tension of fear. For 2 days, he hid the news from her. He tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the effort was a heavy strain. He was distant, his mind constantly on the horizon, watching for any sign of approaching riders. He spent hours cleaning his rifle, checking his ammunition, his movements sharp and jerky. He could not hide the darkness that had settled over him, and Mara felt it. She grew quieter, her own fear a mirror of his. The space between them, once filled with a comfortable silence, now felt charged with his unspoken dread. Finally, she could bear it no longer. That evening, as he stared out the window into the encroaching twilight, she came to stand beside him. "Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm. "You must tell me. What is wrong? What did you see in town?" He turned to look at her, and the lie he had been preparing died on his lips. He could not shield her from this. To do so would be to break the trust they had so carefully built. He owed her the truth, no matter how ugly it was. He said nothing. He simply walked to his saddlebag, which he had left by the door, and pulled out the crumpled wanted poster. He smoothed it out on the table, the crude sketch of her face staring up at them under the lamplight. She looked at it, and all the color drained from her face. She swayed slightly and put a hand on the table to steady herself. Her breath came in a sharp, pained gasp. She traced the name, Mary Belle Cortez, with a trembling finger, her expression one of utter devastation. He saw the strength he had watched her build over the past weeks crumble, leaving behind the same raw, broken terror he had seen on the day he found her. "This is not, I am not," she stammered, shaking her head in denial. "Mara, talk to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing paths down her pale cheeks. She finally looked up at him, her gaze pleading, desperate for him to believe her. "I did kill a man," she confessed, the words tearing from her throat in a ragged whisper. "But it was not murder. I did it to survive." She began to speak, her voice gaining strength as the story poured out of her. She told him of the outlaw who had cornered her in their camp one night, his eyes cruel, his breath sour with whiskey. He had not been interested in her money. He had seen the heavy silver necklace around her neck. "He wanted this," she said, her hand flying to her throat, her fingers wrapping around the familiar, solid shape of the chain. "He said it would fetch a high price. He tried to tear it from my neck." Her voice broke, and she fought for control. "He hit me. He was going to kill me for it. There was a pistol on his belt. I grabbed it. I did not think. I shot him." She was shaking now, reliving the horror of that moment. "The others, they would have killed me for it, but the lawmen attacked the camp right then. In all the shooting, all the chaos, I just ran until I could not run anymore. That is when I found the wagon." Eli listened, his fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. The image of a man trying to rip the necklace from her, of her fighting back in sheer desperation, burned in his mind. "Why this necklace, Mara?" he asked gently. "Why was he so willing to kill for it? Why were you?" "It was my mother's," she whispered, her gaze distant, lost in a memory of another time, another life. "It is all I have left of my home, of my family." She looked at him, her eyes full of a history of pain he could only begin to imagine. "We lived in Mexico, a long time ago, before the war, before the border changed and made our home into a foreign land. My family. They were all killed in the fighting. The necklace was all I could save. It is my whole life. Eli, it is everything I have lost." The pieces of her story clicked into place. Mary Bell Cortez. The name on the poster was her own. The woman accused of murder was her. The law saw a member of an outlaw gang who had killed one of her own, but he saw the truth. He saw a survivor, a girl who had been forged in the fires of war and loss, who had killed not out of greed, but to protect the last remnant of her shattered family, the last piece of her own soul. He was torn. Everything in him, his love for her, his gut instinct, screamed that she was innocent of any real crime. But the law did not care about the truth of a person's heart. The law cared about the poster, the bounty, and the body of a dead outlaw. To protect her was to become an outlaw himself, to stand against the very rule of law he had always, in his own quiet way, respected. He looked at her, at the tears streaming down her face, at the terrible, fragile hope in her eyes, and he knew there was no choice. The law be damned. That night, he held her as she cried, her body shaking with grief and fear. He stroked her hair, murmuring quiet, comforting words, his own heart aching with the knowledge that their brief, fragile peace was over. The world was coming for them, with its greed, its guns, and its blind justice, and he would have to be ready to meet it. The air in the cabin grew thin and sharp with unspoken fear. Every shadow that danced on the wall seemed to hold the shape of a man with a gun. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. The wanted poster Eli had smoothed out on the table remained there, a permanent testament to the death of their fragile peace. They did not sleep that night. Mara sat by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees, her gaze fixed on the dying embers. Eli stood watch by the window, his rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the moonlit prairie for any sign of movement. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was a taut wire of dread. By the gray light of dawn, Eli had made his decision. Redemption was no longer a place of supply, but a source of danger. His ranch was no longer a sanctuary, but a trap. Their only hope lay in the jagged, unforgiving spine of the mountains to the north. A wilderness so vast and desolate that even the most determined man could get lost in it. "Pack what you can carry," he told her, his voice low and grim. "Food, a blanket, nothing more. We ride in 10 minutes. There was no argument, no question. She simply nodded, her eyes dark with a weary understanding, and moved to do as he said. He worked with a cold, desperate efficiency, his movements swift and precise. He filled saddlebags with dried jerky, hardtack, a small sack of coffee, and a tin of medical supplies. He loaded his rifle and his pistol, stuffing extra cartridges into every available pocket. He saddled Cinder and the gentle mare Mara had learned to ride, cinching the straps tight. He was leaving behind the life he had built with his own 2 hands, the house, the barn, the land that held his sweat and his solitude. He was walking away from it all for the woman who now stood in the doorway, a small bundle in her hands, her face pale but resolute in the morning light. They rode north, away from the rising sun, their long shadows stretching out before them like roads to a forgotten place. They did not look back. The journey was a brutal baptism into a new kind of existence. They left the rolling plains behind and entered a land of rock and wind. They navigated through deep, wind-swept canyons where the air was always cold and the sound of their horses' hooves echoed like ghosts. They crossed rivers where the water was so clear and frigid it stole the breath from their lungs and numbed their horses' legs to the bone. They climbed desolate, scree-covered ridges where the wind howled a ceaseless, mournful song and tried to tear the hats from their heads. The harshness of the terrain stripped them down to the essentials of survival. There was no room for anything but the next step, the next meal, the next safe place to rest. And in that stripping away, their bond, forged in the quiet cabin, was tempered into something stronger, more resilient. They began to move as one, anticipating each other's needs without the need for words. He would find the trail, and she would spot the scarce patches of graze for the horses. She would gather wood for the fire, and he would hunt, bringing back a rabbit or a grouse for their meager supper. In the vast, intimidating silence of the wilderness, Mara began to change. The fear in her eyes, while ever present, was now overlaid with a layer of tough resilience. She started to believe, in a small, cautious corner of her heart, that they might actually survive this, that they might survive together. One evening, as they sat by a small, crackling fire, the immense, star-dusted sky arching over them, she spoke of it. "I dream, sometimes," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I dream of a place where there are no posters with my name, where no one looks at me with suspicion." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "A small house, a garden, where the only sounds are the wind and the birds. A place to be quiet, a place to be free." Eli listened, his heart aching with the simple, impossible beauty of her dream. He wanted to give her that place. He wanted to build it for her with his own hands. He reached across the small fire, and his hand briefly covered hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of solidarity, a silent promise that he would die trying to make her dream a reality. Several days into their journey, as they were scrambling down a steep, rocky embankment, the mare Mara was riding lost its footing. The horse went down, and Mara was thrown, her arm scraping hard against the jagged rock face. It was not a serious injury, just a long, ugly burn from the friction, but it was painful and needed tending. That night, they made camp in a small, sheltered cove, protected from the relentless wind by a high wall of rock. The fire they built was small, its flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. The cold was biting, seeping into their bones. Mara sat huddled in her blanket, her face tight with pain. Eli saw her shiver, not just from the cold, but from the pain of her injury. After they ate their scant meal of jerky and hardtack, she looked at the angry red wound on her forearm. "I must clean this," she said, her voice strained. The burn ran from her wrist up past her elbow, and the sleeve of her dress was tight against it. With a deep breath, she began to unbutton the bodice of her simple wool dress to give herself room to tend to the injury. Eli, ever respectful of her privacy, immediately turned his head, looking away toward the darkness beyond the fire. It was an instinct born of propriety, a gesture to give her the space and dignity she deserved. He heard the soft rustle of the fabric, the quiet hiss of her breath as the cool air touched her skin. "Eli!" Her voice was a quiet command, stopping him. He did not turn. "You saved me once," she whispered into the near silence, her voice trembling slightly. "When I was covered in soot and blood, you were not afraid to look at me. You were not afraid to touch me. Do not turn away now." He slowly turned back to face her. She had unbuttoned her dress to her waist, pushing it off one shoulder to fully expose her arm and the slope of her collarbone in the faint, flickering light of the dying fire. Her skin seemed to glow. She looked vulnerable, but her eyes were steady, holding his with an intensity that took his breath away. It was an invitation, an act of supreme trust that went far beyond the simple need to clean a wound. He moved to her side, kneeling in the dirt before her, He took the clean cloth and the small flask of water he used for drinking. His hands, usually so steady and capable, trembled as he soaked the cloth and gently began to clean the raw, scraped skin of her arm. She did not flinch, did not make a sound, but he could feel the tension in her body. He worked in silence, his touch as gentle as he could make it, his entire world narrowing to this single, intimate act. When he finished cleaning the wound, he noticed her skin felt unnaturally warm. He reached up, his knuckles brushing against her cheek to check for fever. His touch lingered for a second longer than necessary. Her skin was hot. His gaze drifted to her neck, to the heavy silver chain that rested in the hollow of her throat. It seemed to lie differently than before. The chain looked tighter, as if it were biting into her skin, leaving a faint red line. "You are feverish," he murmured, his voice thick. He reached toward the necklace, his intention only to feel the skin beneath it, to see if the irritation he had noticed before had worsened. As his fingers brushed against the cold metal, her hand shot up and covered his, stopping him. Her eyes were wide, her breath catching in her throat. "Please," she whispered, the familiar, desperate plea. "Do not take it off." He stopped, his hand still trapped beneath hers, their fingers intertwined over the necklace. The air between them crackled, her fear, his concern, their shared solitude, the raw vulnerability of the moment. It all coalesced into something powerful and overwhelming. He looked from her terrified eyes to her mouth, her lips slightly parted. The desperation of their flight, the comfort he found in her presence, the deep, aching love that had taken root in his lonely heart. It all surged through him at once. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not move. Their lips met. It was not a soft or gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and survival, a raw and honest collision of two lost souls in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything they had become to each other, protector and protected, savior and saved. It was filled with the fear of the coming dawn and the unspoken hope that they might live to see another. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, their breathing ragged, the fire nothing but a bed of glowing red embers at their feet. The next morning, the world shattered. They had just finished saddling the horses when the shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. It came without warning, a deafening crack that sent a flock of birds scattering into the sky. Eli felt a white-hot, searing pain explode in his left shoulder. The force of the impact threw him backward, and he landed hard on the rocky ground, the world tilting crazily. A man stepped out from behind a cluster of boulders not 50 yards away. He was tall and gaunt, with a cruel, thin-lipped smile. He held a smoking rifle in his hands. A bounty hunter, he had tracked them. "That is far enough. Cortez!" the man sneered, his eyes filled with a greedy light. The poster said dead or alive. Dead is easier. He began to raise his rifle again, aiming for a finishing shot. Mara screamed, a sound of pure fury. Before Eli could even process what was happening, she moved. She was not the terrified girl he had found by the wagon. She was a cornered animal, a lioness defending her mate. She launched herself at the bounty hunter, a whirlwind of desperation and rage. The man, surprised by her ferocity, barely had time to react. She slammed into him, and he stumbled backward. He tried to bring the butt of his rifle around to strike her, but she was too close, too fast. Her hands flew to her own neck, not in fear, but as if grabbing a weapon. She ripped the heavy silver necklace from her throat, the chain snapping, in one fluid, brutal motion. She looped the chain around the bounty hunter's neck and pulled with all her might. The man gagged, his eyes bulging. He dropped his rifle, his hands clawing at the silver chain that was biting into his throat. He was bigger and stronger than her, but her attack was fueled by a love and fury he could not comprehend. He thrashed, trying to throw her off. But she held on, her knuckles white, her face a mask of grim determination. Eli, his vision swimming, pushed himself up onto one elbow. His shoulder was a vortex of agony, but the sight of Mara in mortal danger cleared his head. He drew his pistol from its holster, his hand slick with his own blood. He took aim, the world wavering in and out of focus. He fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bounty hunter stiffened, a look of surprise on his face, and then he collapsed, pulling Mara down with him. Silence descended, absolute and profound. Mara scrambled out from under the dead man, the broken silver chain still clutched in her hand. She rushed to Eli's side, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Eli! Oh, God! Eli!" she cried, her hands hovering over his bleeding shoulder. They stared at the body of the man they had killed. He was no longer a threat, no longer a monster. He was just a dead man, his eyes open to the indifferent blue sky. The world would not see this as self-defense. They would see it as two murderers trying to escape justice. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. Working together, their movements clumsy with shock and pain, they dragged the body to a shallow ravine and covered it with rocks. It was a grim, silent burial, a final punctuation to their lost innocence. By midday, Eli's wound had begun to throb with a deep, pulsing heat. A fever was setting in. The sky, which had been clear that morning, was now filling with heavy, gray clouds. A cold wind picked up, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of snow. They had to find shelter. They traveled for hours, Eli slumping forward in his saddle, his body swaying with a dangerous weakness. Mara rode beside him, her face a mask of worry, constantly urging him to stay awake. Just as dusk began to settle, and the first delicate flakes of snow began to drift down from the sky, they found it. Tucked away in a high, isolated valley was an abandoned mining cabin, little more than a one-room shack, its roof sagging, its windows boarded up. It was a desolate, forgotten place. But to them, it was a miracle. Inside, it was dark and cold, the air thick with the dust of years, but it had 4 walls and a roof. Mara helped Eli from his horse and half-dragged him inside, settling him onto a pile of old, dusty burlap sacks in a corner. The snow was falling heavily now, a thick, white curtain that was quickly erasing their tracks, trapping them in this high, lonely place. As the fever took hold, the world began to dissolve for Eli. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body alternating between bone-rattling chills and burning heat. The cabin, the snow, the pain, it all blurred into a nightmarish dreamscape. Through it all, there was one constant: Mara. She was a tireless, desperate ghost in the shadows of his fever. He felt her cool hands on his forehead, heard her voice, a soft, constant murmur that was the only thing anchoring him to the world. She nursed him, cleaning his wound with snowmelt and the last of their whiskey, tearing strips from her own petticoat for bandages. And as she worked, she whispered to him, her words a tangled blend of prayer and confession, of Spanish and broken English. "Dios mío, ayúdalo, please, do not leave me alone." She would plead to a God she had likely long forgotten. Then her whispers would turn to him, as if confessing to a priest. "It is my fault, mi culpa, the poster, the bounty. I bring this on you." She would speak of her family, of her home, her words painting fragmented pictures of a life of sunshine and music, a life before the fire and the blood. In the depths of his delirium, her whispers were both a comfort and a torment, the soft, sad story of the woman he had tried to save, who was now desperately trying to save him. The world beyond the cabin walls vanished. Snow fell for 3 days without pause, a silent, ceaseless deluge that buried the landscape, sealed the valley, and transformed their small shack into a prison of white. The silence was the most haunting part. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind around the eaves and the frantic, desperate beating of their own hearts. Their isolation was absolute, a stark physical manifestation of the lonely path they now walked together, trapped in the dusty, cold air of the forgotten cabin. Time began to lose its meaning, dissolving into a nightmarish cycle of fever and fear. For Eli, the world became a fever dream. The searing pain in his shoulder was the anchor for a sea of terrifying visions that tossed him back and forth between a burning past and a frozen present. He dreamt of fire. He was back at the burned-out wagon, the flames leaping high, the air thick with the smell of scorched wood and death. But in his dream, Mara stood untouched in the center of the inferno, and the silver necklace she wore did not reflect the light. It bled it. The chain glowed with a dull, angry red of a hot coal, a brand against her skin. He dreamt of blood. The face of the bounty hunter he had killed appeared before him, his eyes wide with surprise, the dark stain spreading across his chest. Then the face would morph into his own, and he would feel the cold, wet seep of his own lifeblood soaking into the dirt floor of the cabin. Through it all, there was Mara, her face a mask of sorrow, her hands stained red as she tried to press the life back into him, and always the necklace, pulsing with a malevolent, crimson light, a beating heart of their shared violence and pain. He would wake from these nightmares, his body drenched in sweat despite the biting cold, his throat raw from a scream he could not release. In moments of fractured lucidity, he would see her, a ghost in the dim light. She was always there, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, forcing sips of snowmelt between his cracked lips. But she too was fading. The ordeal had taken its toll. She grew thinner, her high cheekbones becoming sharp and pronounced. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dark eyes were enormous in her gaunt face, burning with a feverish light that seemed to mirror his own. She was a reflection of his own decay, and the sight of her slow wasting filled him with a terror that was colder and sharper than any fever chill. As his fever finally began to break, leaving him weak and hollowed out, he became acutely aware of her suffering. She moved like a sleepwalker, her energy almost completely spent. The wound on her arm had become infected, and he saw her clench her jaw against the pain. But it was the necklace that seemed to torment her the most. He would find her staring into the small, sputtering fire, her hand at her throat, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the silver chain. "It burns," she whispered one afternoon, her voice a dry rasp. "It is so heavy, it burns my skin." He saw the angry red line on her neck where the chain rested. It was deeper now, inflamed and raw. "Then take it off, Mara," he said, his own voice weak but urgent. "Just for a little while. Let the skin breathe." She recoiled as if he had struck her, her eyes widening with a familiar, frantic terror. "No, I cannot! I can never take it off!" She clutched it tighter, a gesture that was both protective and pained. This was the moment the fever dream planted its poison seed in his waking mind. He looked at her, trapped in her own suffering, clinging to the very object that seemed to be the source of her torment. His desperate, loving heart, clouded by weakness and fear, could find only one explanation. The necklace was a curse. It was a physical manifestation of all the horror she had endured, a chain of guilt and grief that was now literally consuming her. He became convinced that her past, her pain, the blood she had shed, it was all bound up in that piece of silver, and he believed, with the unshakable conviction of a desperate man, that if he could just remove it, he could sever that connection. He could free her. He could save her. His desperation grew with each passing hour. He watched her weaken, watched her wince in pain, watched her touch the necklace with a mixture of reverence and agony. His love for her, so fierce and protective, twisted into a frantic, misguided resolve. He would not watch her die. He would commit this one act, this violation of his promise, as an act of ultimate mercy. He would cut the curse from her throat and carry the burden of her anger himself, if it meant she would live. The decision settled upon him late one night. The snow had finally stopped, and the world outside was eerily silent, bathed in the cold, white light of a full moon that filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls. Mara was asleep on a pallet of blankets near the fire, her breathing shallow and uneven, even in sleep. Her brow was furrowed with pain, and her hand rested near her throat, as if guarding the necklace even in her dreams. Eli rose from his own bed of sacks, his movements slow and stiff. Every step was an agony, his wounded shoulder a constant, throbbing reminder of their shared violence. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her sleeping form. In the moonlight, her face was a portrait of suffering. He could clearly see the angry, red welt that encircled her neck. He had to do it. He had to set her free. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear, his own heart hammering against his ribs. "You do not need to carry it anymore," he whispered, the words a prayer, an absolution for the promise he was about to break. "I will carry it for you." His hands, clumsy with weakness and trembling with the enormity of what he was about to do, went to the clasp at the back of her neck. It was old and stiff, and would not yield. Panic flared in his chest. He could not wake her. He could not fail. His fingers fumbled, and then, with a surge of desperate strength, he simply gripped the chain on either side of the clasp and pulled. The old silver, weakened by time and strain, snapped with a faint but distinct sound, a sound like a bone breaking. The effect on Mara was instantaneous. Her eyes flew open, not with the slow confusion of waking, but with a sudden, soul-deep recognition of violation. She saw the broken chain in his hands, saw the necklace lying free on her chest, and a scream tore from her throat. It was not a scream of fear or of pain, but of pure, undiluted anguish, a sound of something sacred being desecrated. "No!" she shrieked, scrambling backward away from him, her hands flying to her bare throat. "What have you done?" She looked at him, her eyes wild with a horror and betrayal that cut him deeper than any bullet. "Please, do not take it off." The familiar words were no longer a plea, but a shattered, broken cry of the damned. "Please, no!" "Mara, listen to me," he pleaded, holding the necklace out to her, desperate to make her understand. "It was hurting you. It was a curse. I did it to save you." But she was not listening. She was sobbing, great, tearing gasps that seemed to rip through her entire body, her gaze fixed on the object in his hand, confused and frantic to prove his purpose, to show her the evil he had removed. His eyes fell upon the centerpiece of the necklace. It was not just an ornament, but a small, heavy locket. His trembling fingers fumbled with the tiny catch. He had to know. He had to see the darkness it held inside. The locket sprang open. There was no curse inside. There was no dark magic. There was only memory. Resting on a bed of faded velvet was a tiny, perfect lock of baby-fine dark hair, tied with a single strand of thread. Beside it lay a small, folded square of linen, perhaps cut from a child's shirt or blanket. Stitched into the cloth in faint, uneven thread were two small initials, E.C., and marring the simple fabric was a dark, rust-colored stain, an old blood stain. The air left Eli's lungs, a cold dread, far more terrifying than any fever dream, washed over him. He looked from the heartbreakingly small contents of the locket to Mara's face. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow, and the weight of his catastrophic mistake threatened to crush him. Mara collapsed, her body folding in on itself as if her bones had turned to dust. The full, unbearable truth poured out of her in a torrent of choked, weeping confession. "My baby," she sobbed, the words almost unintelligible through her grief. "My little boy, Esteban. He was my son." She told him then the story she had held locked away for years. The ambush where her family had died was not the same one where she had been captured by the outlaws. It had happened years before, a different lifetime ago. She had been traveling with her husband and their infant son when they were attacked. Her husband was killed. Her baby had been torn from her arms and silenced forever. The lock of hair, the piece of his blanket with his initials, that was all she had managed to save.
It was his soul,
she wept, reaching a trembling hand toward the locket. I kept his soul in there, close to my heart, so he would not be alone, so I would not be alone. It was all I had left of him. It was all I had. Eli stared at what he had done. He had not removed a curse. He had broken open a tomb. He had not saved her from her past. He had ripped away the one sacred thing that had allowed her to survive it. The burning on her neck was not from a curse. It was a psychosomatic pain, the constant physical manifestation of a mother's unending grief. His act of love was the cruelest violation imaginable. He broke the strength that had carried them through canyons and gunfights, the resolve that had faced down prejudice and bounty hunters. It all crumbled into dust. A great ragged sob was torn from his own chest. He dropped the locket and gathered her into his arms, pulling her shaking, broken body against his. He held her as she shook uncontrollably, his own tears falling into her hair, his body racked with a guilt so profound it felt like it was dissolving him from the inside out. For days afterward, she did not speak. She did not eat. She sat on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, her back against the cold cabin wall, and stared out a crack in the boarded window at the endless, unforgiving expanse of white snow. Her eyes were vacant, her face a still mask of grief. She had retreated to a place so deep inside herself that he could not reach her. The life, the fight, the fragile hope he had seen grow in her, it was all gone, extinguished by his own foolish, arrogant hands. The world outside mirrored the desolation within. At night, they could hear the howling of wolves, their cries circling the small cabin, hungry and predatory. They were a pack, drawn by the scent of weakness, of death, inside, trapped with the ghost of a murdered child and the deafening silence of a shattered woman. Eli's guilt grew unbearable. It was a living thing, a wolf pacing the confines of his own heart, tearing at him, reminding him with every beat that he had not saved the woman he loved. He had destroyed her. Spring arrived in the high country not as a gentle guest, but as a reluctant thaw. It came in the slow, persistent drip of melting snow from the cabin's eaves, a sound like a clock measuring out the slow return of time. It came in the trickling rivulets of water that carved paths through the deep snow, revealing the dark, sleeping earth beneath. And it came in the gradual, agonizingly slow return of life to Mara's eyes. She did not recover from her grief. She learned to carry it. The terrible, vacant silence that had entombed her for days began to recede, replaced by a quiet so profound it seemed a part of the landscape itself. She was more distant, her smiles gone, her laughter a forgotten language. But she began to move again, to eat, to help Eli as he slowly regained his strength. His guilt was a constant, palpable presence between them, a third soul in their tiny, isolated world. He worked tirelessly, his penance a physical thing. He repaired the sagging roof, patched the chinks in the log walls with mud and moss, and built a crude but sturdy table and 2 chairs. He was trying to build a new world for them, a fortress against the one that had tried to destroy them. One afternoon, as he sat cleaning his rifle, his shoulders still stiff and aching, he could bear the silence no longer. He went to the small wooden box where he had placed the pieces of her broken past. He knelt before her, as he had that first night in his cabin, and held out his open hands. In one palm lay the 2 halves of the broken silver chain. In the other lay the open locket, the tiny lock of hair and the blood-stained cloth still nestled inside. "Mara," he said, his voice thick with a shame so deep it was almost a physical pain. "There are no words. What I did, it was a sin without a name. I cannot take it back. I can only spend the rest of my days trying to make it right." She looked at the contents of his hands for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took the pieces from him. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply went to the fire and, using a pair of old pliers Eli had found and a small piece of wire from a snare, she began to mend the broken chain. She worked for hours, her concentration absolute, her small, deft fingers painstakingly looping the wire to join the two ends. It was a clumsy repair, a visible scar on the beautiful, intricate silver, but when she was done, the chain was whole once more. She closed the locket, the click of the tiny catch echoing in the quiet cabin, and hung it back around her own neck. She was reclaiming her sorrow, making it a part of her again, but on her own terms. Their new life was one of grim, determined survival. Eli planned to take them further north as soon as the mountain passes were clear, to a place where the name Maribel Cortez had never been heard. But the world was not yet finished with them. One afternoon, a grizzled old prospector, leading a stubborn mule, passed through their valley. He was the first human being they had seen in months. He shared their fire and their coffee, and he shared news from the world below. "Sheriff Cobb, down in Redemption. He ain't letting up," the old man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the fire. "Got it in his head to clear the mountains of all this bounty hunter trouble. He's been asking questions, forming a posse. Word is he's riding up this way come the end of the week, sweeping the whole territory clean." The news struck Eli like a physical blow. The law was coming. Their time had run out. His first instinct was to flee, to pack their meager belongings and ride immediately, to push deeper into the untamed wilderness. "We have to go," he said to Mara as soon as the prospector had gone. "Tonight, we will ride north until there is nowhere left to go." But Mara shook her head. She stood before him, and for the first time since he had broken her, he saw a fire rekindle in the depths of her eyes. It was not the bright, vibrant flame of happiness, but the hard, steady fire of resolve.
"No,"
she said, her voice quiet but unshakable.
"No more running."
"Mara, they will hang you," he pleaded, his voice raw with desperation.
"My whole life, I have been running," she said, her gaze steady and clear. "I ran from the war that killed my parents. I ran from the bandits that killed my husband. I ran from the outlaws and the lawmen, and all this time, I kept my son's memory hidden, locked away, like it was a secret to be ashamed of." She touched the locket at her throat. "When you broke this chain, Eli, you did a terrible thing, but you also forced me to look at him, to remember him not just with sorrow, but with love. My son deserved a mother who lived, not one who just survived in the shadows."
She took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening.
"I will not hide anymore. I will not spend the rest of my life in a frozen prison, real or of my own making. I want to feel the sun on my face. I want to live. And if that means I must die to be free, then I will die on my feet, in the light."
He saw the unbending strength in her, a power he had never seen before, and he knew he could not argue. Her decision was made. They would not run. They would ride back toward redemption and face whatever was to come, together. The journey down from the mountains was a descent into a world being reborn. The valleys that had been choked with ice were now carpeted with the tender green of new grass. The sagebrush was in bloom, its sharp, clean scent filling the air. The land itself seemed to ache with a mixture of sorrow for the winter that had passed and a fierce, vibrant hope for the life that was to come. They rode side by side, no longer a protector and his ward, but partners, equals, two solitary souls facing a shared fate. They reached the outskirts of redemption as the afternoon sun began its long, slow descent, casting the landscape in a golden, dusty light. They were riding through a narrow, rocky pass when the trap was sprung. It was not Sheriff Cobb and his posse who met them. It was a group of 4 bounty hunters, their faces hard and greedy, who had been lying in wait. The world exploded in a chaos of sound and fury. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. Dust and gun smoke filled the air, choking them. One of the men yelled her name. "Cortez!" The sound a curse. Eli reacted instantly, pulling his rifle from its scabbard and returning fire, his movements fluid and deadly. Mara, her face pale but set with determination, dismounted and took cover behind a rock. The rifle Eli had taught her to use held steady in her hands. A bullet whined past Eli's ear. He fired back, and one of the men cried out and fell from his saddle. Mara fired a moment later, her shot forcing another man to dive for cover. They were fighting back to back, a desperate two-person army against a world that wanted them dead. A bullet kicked up a spray of rock near Mara's head, and a shard grazed her arm, drawing blood. Eli saw the flash of red on her sleeve, and a cold, protective rage surged through him. He saw another bounty hunter taking careful aim at her from a high ridge. There was no time to think. He spurred Cinder forward, placing his own body directly between Mara and the gunman, giving her a clear path to better cover. He raised his own pistol to fire at the man, but he was a moment too late. A shot rang out, and a white-hot agony erupted in his chest. The force of the bullet knocked him from the saddle, and the world went dark before he even hit the ground. Mara screamed his name, a sound of pure, heart-shattering anguish. She saw him fall, saw the two remaining bounty hunters start to advance, their faces triumphant, with a surge of strength born of love and desperation. She laid down a volley of covering fire, forcing them back, and then ran to Eli's side. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him, his dead weight a terrible burden, behind a large granite boulder. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, his eyes were closed, and a dark, terrible stain was spreading across the front of his shirt. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled his head in her lap, crying his name over and over. She looked down at the necklace resting against her own chest, the necklace he had so terribly misunderstood, the locket that held the soul of her lost child. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. Her trembling fingers went to the crude, wire-wrapped clasp. With a final, loving look at the locket, she lifted it from around her own neck. The skin where it had rested for so long felt cold and bare. She leaned over Eli, her tears dripping onto his pale face, and gently fastened the chain around his neck, letting the locket rest over his heart. It was the ultimate act of faith, the ultimate sacrifice. She was giving him the only sacred thing she had left in the world. She was giving him her son's soul for protection.
"Now it keeps you safe,"
she whispered, her voice choked with a sob. She picked up her rifle, her grief transformed into a cold, hard fury. She was preparing to make her final stand when another sound cut through the air, the thunder of a dozen horses, and a loud, commanding voice. "Drop your weapons! This is the sheriff!" Sheriff Cobb and his posse rode into the pass, their guns drawn. The two remaining bounty hunters, caught between the law and the furious woman behind the rock, threw down their pistols in surrender. The sheriff dismounted and walked slowly toward the scene. He took in the dead men, the wounded, unconscious form of Eli McGraw, and the fierce, tear-streaked woman who stood over him, rifle in hand. He saw the ornate silver locket lying on Eli's chest, a strange and intimate detail in the bloody tableau. He looked into Mara's eyes, and he did not see a murderer. He saw a survivor. He saw a woman who had fought like a wildcat for the man who had sheltered her. He saw a story far more complicated than the one written on his wanted poster. He looked at the dead bounty hunters, then at the blood-soaked ground. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man who had seen too much of the West's brutal arithmetic. "The past in these parts is too blood-stained to judge," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned to one of his deputies. "Get those two tied up, and get a wagon. Mr. McGraw needs a doctor, not a jail cell." He looked back at Mara, his gaze holding a hint of something that looked like respect. "As for the girl, it seems to me she has been through enough." They rode away from redemption, battered, bloodied, but alive. Eli survived, his life a testament to a doctor's skill and a woman's unyielding will. The sheriff's official report listed the dead bounty hunters as having shot each other in a dispute over the reward. The name Maribel Cortez was never spoken in that town again. Months later, as the sun set on a warm autumn evening, the world had settled into a new kind of quiet. They were back at Eli's ranch, the fences rebuilt, the land slowly healing from the long drought. At dusk, Mara stood on the porch, watching Eli in the distance. He was repairing a stretch of fence along the horizon, his familiar, steady form, a dark silhouette against the brilliant, painted colors of the dying sun. His shadow was long, stretching across the peaceful land. She raised a hand to her own throat, to the place where the locket had rested for so many years. The skin was bare, marked only by a faint, pale scar.
"Please, do not take it off,"
she whispered to the empty air. But this time, the words were not a plea born of terror. They were a memory, soft and gentle as the evening breeze. They were an epitaph for a pain she had finally learned to carry, and a prayer for the man on the horizon who now carried her heart for safekeeping. The story ended not with a grand triumph, but with quiet redemption. Two scarred souls, forever bound by fire and blood, reaching for a fragile, shared hope beneath the vast and endless western sky. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so you can connect with our community. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.